You have been in this room. A public library on a weekday afternoon, somebody at a laptop in the corner, a science fiction section, and absolutely nothing happening. Two people start arguing loudly a few feet away. The man at the laptop looks up. It takes about a second and a half. That second and a half is why we know his name. 1st of October, 2013, Glen Park Branch, San Francisco. For 2.5 years, investigators have been chasing a person who existed only as a username, and they had not been able to prove he was anybody at all. What finally undid him was not the encryption failing. It was a small, ordinary, human trail he had left on the open internet before there was anything to hide. In the next half hour, the crumb, the agent nobody listened to, the two federal officers who ended up convicted themselves, and the one charge everybody gets wrong. We have covered what the market itself was on this channel before, so I'm going to be quick, because this episode is about the people looking for it, not about the thing they were looking at. A marketplace launched in February 2011. It was seized and shut down in October 2013, roughly 2.5 years from the first listing to the last, which is not long for something this famous. It sold illegal goods, mostly drugs, and structurally it worked the way any marketplace works. Listings, sellers, buyers, ratings and reviews, and a commission taken by whoever was running the place. Two design choices are all you need to hold on to. Payment was in a currency that did not run through a bank, and the site was reached through a network designed to hide where the machine was. That combination is why the case was widely considered close to unsolvable at the time. No bank records anybody could subpoena, and no physical address anybody could raid. The person running it was known publicly only as Dread Pirate Roberts, a name borrowed from a film and chosen very deliberately, because in that film the name is a role that gets handed on from one person to the next. How big was it? This is the first place I have to slow down and be careful with you, because the numbers you will see quoted are not agreed on. What is solid federal analysts traced over 1.2 million transactions across an 18-month window involving more than 100,000 buyers and thousands of sellers. What is not solid is the money. Government filings describe sales in terms of a very large quantity of the currency. Independent estimates put the figure far lower, near $183 million in sales. Those two versions are miles apart, and I am not going to pick one for you, because I would be guessing and calling it research. What matters for this story is not the total anyway. It is that a marketplace of that size operated in the open for 2.5 years while the people investigating it could not put a name to a single human being behind it. And the search for that name did not start with a hacker. It started with a tax agent doing something profoundly unglamorous. 27th of January, 2011. Weeks before the site formally launched, somebody posted about it on a public forum, in the completely ordinary way that anybody announces anything new that they have built. It was the sort of post that gets written once and immediately forgotten by everyone, including the person who wrote it. Here's a thing, it exists, go and look at it. Posted under the username Altoid. Later, the same username posted somewhere else, this time looking for someone to hire for the project, and told anybody interested to get in touch at an email address. The email address contained a real name. That is it. That is the entire break in the case. Not a cryptographic flaw, not an informant, not a leak from inside, a username reused across two posts, one of which invited strangers to write to him directly. And you have to sit with the timing, because the timing is the whole lesson and it is the part that gets skipped. That first post was written before there was anything at all to protect. At the moment it was posted, it was an ordinary piece of promotion by an ordinary person, and there was no reason on earth to be careful with it. The internet does not distinguish between the things you did before you had something to hide and the things you did after. It keeps both at the same resolution forever. The agent who found it was Gary Alford, and he did not work in a cyber unit or anything resembling one. He worked for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Tax Authority, which means his professional instinct was not to attack the system or find a flaw in it, it was to read the paperwork, all of it, in order, including the parts that were years old and looked like nothing. He searched for the earliest public mentions of the site anywhere on the open internet, on the entirely reasonable assumption that whoever built it must, at some point, have told somebody that it existed. That is not a technical insight. It is an accounting instinct applied to a forum, and it is the single most effective thing anybody did in the whole investigation. Now here is the part of the story that everybody who has ever been the junior person in a room will recognize immediately. The lead did not immediately become the case. It sat there for a considerable stretch of time while the investigation carried on doing the difficult technical things it had already decided were necessary. Understand the shape of the room he walked into. This was, by common agreement at the time, one of the hardest technical investigations anybody had attempted. Multiple agencies, serious specialists, real budgets. And into that room walks a tax investigator with a theory built on a forum post from 2 years earlier and a name and an email address. It sounds too simple, and that is the actual problem. It sounds like exactly the sort of thing that somebody would obviously have checked already, precisely because it is so obvious that anybody would think of it. There is a specific failure mode operating here, and it is worth naming carefully because it is not a failure of intelligence. Everybody in that room was clever, experienced, and working hard. When a problem is understood by everyone to be extremely difficult, simple explanations get filtered out on the way in, not examined and rejected on the evidence. Filtered before the evidence is ever looked at. The reasoning runs, this cannot be it, because if it were this, we would have found it already. Which is a sentence that has closed a great many cases far too slowly. Eventually, it was checked properly, and the name held up against everything else the investigation already had in the file. But the delay is part of the public record, and it is the only reason this act exists at all. Because if you take one professional lesson out of this episode, it is not about encryption. It is that the cheapest test in the room should always be run first, especially when you are sure it will fail. While the paperwork trail was moving slowly, a second thread arrived from an entirely different direction, and it arrived by post. In July 2013, a package coming into the United States was intercepted at the border in the entirely ordinary course of customs inspection. Nobody was looking for anything to do with the website. Inside were forged identity documents, several of them, of the kind that would take real effort to obtain, different names on each one, and the same photograph on all of them. They were addressed to a residence in San Francisco. Investigators went to the address, and the man who answered the door matched the photograph. Nothing was arrested that day, and nothing could have been. There was no case yet against the person at that address for anything at all relating to a marketplace. But it put a face, an address, and a documented interest in false identity into a file that already contained a name from an email address. And this is how real investigations actually converge, as opposed to how they converge in films, not in a single moment of insight, but as 2 or 3 unremarkable threads arrive from unrelated agencies and slowly turn out to be pointing at the same street. Customs officers inspecting the International Post, a tax investigator reading forum posts from 2 years earlier. Neither of them was hunting a darknet marketplace when they started their day. The third thread is the technical one, and it is the one where I have to be most careful with you because the official account of it is publicly disputed by named experts in the field. Here is what is agreed, and it is worth separating carefully from what is not. The hidden service ran on a server physically located in Germany. The data behind it sat on a second machine in Iceland. Investigators located that Icelandic machine. And once you have your hands on the physical server, the anonymity of absolutely everything running on it is finished, immediately and permanently. The question is how they found it, and this is where the record splits. In 2014, an FBI agent named Christopher Tarbell filed a sworn declaration explaining it. His account was that the site's own login page was misconfigured. In his telling, entering material into that page caused the server to respond in a way that revealed its real address to an ordinary web browser, outside the anonymity network entirely, where anybody could read it. a configuration mistake, in other words, rather than an attack. The kind of ordinary error that any rush deployment can contain, and that nobody ever notices until the day it matters enormously. That account was immediately and publicly challenged by security researchers, including an expert witness engaged by the defense. Their objection was not that it is technically impossible, because it is not. It was that the declaration was vague about the details, and that the forensic artifacts you would expect a method like that to leave behind were never produced. Some argued that a different agency had located the server by other means entirely, and that the account eventually given to the court was a reconstruction, built to be presentable, rather than a description of what actually happened. I want to be precise about the status of that. It is an argument made publicly by named experts. It is not an established fact, and no court accepted it. So the honest position, and the one this program is going to take, is that there is a sworn account on one side and a serious public expert dispute about it on the other. And that dispute was never resolved anywhere. I would rather leave you with an unresolved question you can look into than hand you a clean version of a story that is not clean. And now the part of this case that almost nobody knows, which is that 2 federal agents working the investigation went to prison for what they did during it. Both were on the same Baltimore-based federal task force working the case. Both were later convicted in court. These are public convictions of public officials acting in their official capacity, so we can name them. Carl Force was an agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration, assigned to the case. During the investigation, he created online personas that were never authorized by anybody above him. Using those personas, he sold investigative information to the very person the task force was hunting, and he was paid for it in the currency the marketplace ran on. He pleaded guilty to extortion, money laundering, and obstruction of justice, and was sentenced to 6.5 years. Sean Bridges was a Secret Service agent on that same task force. He obtained administrative access to accounts on the marketplace itself and moved funds out of them into his own control. He admitted stealing around $820,000 in cryptocurrency and was sentenced to 5 years and 11 months. He was later sentenced again, in a separate matter, for stealing a further 1,606 units of that currency from government custody. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is genuinely strange. An investigation into a market for illegal goods contained inside itself 2 officers running their own private operation against both sides at once. And it matters legally, not just as an irony worth mentioning, because everything those 2 men touched during the investigation became contestable evidence for the defense to attack. This is a genuine structural hazard in this kind of case, and it is not unique to this one at all. When the investigators can move money invisibly too, the same anonymity that protects the target protects them just as well. Which is a design problem, not a character problem. Any system where value can be moved without a record is a system where oversight has to come from somewhere other than the ledger. By the autumn of 2013, investigators had a name, an address, a face, and a server. What they still did not have was the one thing that would actually end the case. They needed the laptop open, unlocked, logged in, and with the person's hand still resting on it. Anything less than all 4 of those and the case might never be provable. This is the single most underappreciated fact about the entire case, and it is the one worth carrying out of this episode. Every piece of protection in that system was working correctly, right up until the moment of the arrest. Full disk encryption protects a closed machine. It protects nothing about a machine that is open and in use. So an arrest that happens at the front door, or in a car, or at 4 a.m. in a bedroom hands you a locked box. That is a case you may never be able to open, no matter how many warrants you have. Which is why the arrest happened where it did, in the way it did. 1st of October, 2013. The Glen Park branch of the San Francisco Public Library, an ordinary quiet afternoon in a small neighborhood building with a handful of people in it. 2 agents began arguing loudly behind him, in what looked from every angle like an ordinary public disturbance between 2 members of the public in a quiet room. He turned to look, and in that moment, a 3rd agent took the laptop out from under his hands, open, unlocked, and running. The rest of the arrest took seconds. The important part had already happened. That machine went on to become the central exhibit of the prosecution. It is now held by the FBI as a historical artifact of the investigation, which tells you what they think it was worth. And I want to underline the technique because it has nothing to do with computers at all. The security of that entire system at the decisive moment came down to one person's attention, not a key length, not a protocol, not a piece of software, where somebody happened to be looking. Every security model has a boundary somewhere, a point where it stops being mathematics and starts being a human being standing in a room. That boundary is almost always the cheapest place to attack the whole thing. The trial ran in the Southern District of New York in January and February of 2015. On the 4th of February 2015, after a trial lasting a matter of weeks, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 7 counts. Those counts included distributing narcotics, several conspiracy charges relating to that distribution, running a continuing criminal enterprise, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The prosecution's case was not really about the internet at all. It was the much simpler proposition that this specific individual was the person operating the account behind the marketplace across the whole period it ran. And that turned on the material recovered from the laptop, which is why the way it was seized mattered so much. The defense's position was that others had operated the account at various times, and that the evidence could not exclude a different person being behind it at any given moment. The jury did not accept it. The conviction was later affirmed on appeal by the Second Circuit, and the Supreme Court declined to take the case. So the conviction itself is not a contested one, and I want that clearly on the record. It went the full distance through the appellate system, and it stood at every level. I am spelling that out because in a few minutes, I am going to tell you about a charge that was never tried at all, and the two facts need to stay separate in your head. 29th of May, 2015. Sentencing. Life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. 2 life sentences, plus 40 years, plus lifetime supervised release, which is the part of the sentence that only makes sense as a formality. That sentence was, by any measure anybody has proposed, at the extreme end for the offenses he was actually convicted of, and it became immediately and lastingly controversial. Supporters of the sentence argued that the scale was genuinely unprecedented, that real harm flowed from it at that scale, and that the operator of a marketplace is not a bystander to what the marketplace does all day. Critics argued that a first-time nonviolent offender receiving a sentence heavier than many people convicted of violent crimes is not proportionality, whatever else you want to call it. Both of those arguments were made loudly and publicly at the time by serious people, and neither of them is mine to settle for you. What I can do is make sure you have the record straight, and the record has one detail in it that is misreported almost every single time the story is told. You have almost certainly heard that this case involved murder for hire allegations. It did. And here is what actually happened with them. They were contained in an entirely separate indictment, brought in 2013 in the District of Maryland, a different court, a different prosecutor's office, a different case number. He was never tried on them. There was no trial, no evidence tested in front of a jury, no cross-examination of a single witness, and no verdict of any kind. On the 20th of July, 2018, the United States Attorney for Maryland, Robert Hur, moved to dismiss that indictment. It was dismissed with prejudice. That is a legal term with a hard meaning. It can never be brought again. The reason given in the motion was practical rather than exculpatory. The conviction in New York had been affirmed on appeal, and the Supreme Court had declined to hear it, so a further prosecution served no useful purpose. So the honest sentence is this: those allegations were made, they were never tried, they were never proven, and they were permanently dismissed. And yet they follow the story everywhere it goes, usually attached with a word like convicted or accompanied by a photograph and a headline, which is simply and straightforwardly false. I am laboring this point because this program is called Unmasked, and it is about people who were caught on the record with the receipts. The record is the entire product. There is nothing else here. The moment we start letting untried allegations ride along because they make the story better, we are not doing this. We are doing something else that looks like it. He was convicted of 7 serious counts and sentenced to life in prison. That is more than enough story for anybody. It does not need any help, and it certainly does not need decoration. Which brings us to the part that did not exist when most documentaries about this case were made. On the 21st of January, 2025, he received a full and unconditional presidential pardon. He had served more than 11 years of a life sentence at that point. He walked out of a federal prison the same week. A full pardon is not a finding of innocence, and it is not an appeal succeeding on the merits. The conviction stands as a matter of record. What the pardon removes is the punishment. The reaction split immediately, and it split along lines that were not the usual ones. Members of Congress publicly condemned it in 4 statements that sit in the congressional record, describing it as clemency granted for large-scale drug trafficking. Others had campaigned for years on the proportionality argument and treated it as the correction of a sentence that should never have been imposed. And I am going to do exactly what this channel did the last time this subject came up, which is to give you the 3 dates in order and then stop talking. Convicted, February 2015. Sentenced to life, May 2015. Fully pardoned, January 2025. Whether that sentence was proportionate and whether that pardon was right are questions people hold strong and opposing views about. This program is not the place where you get my opinion instead of the record. You have the dates. What you conclude is yours. What I will give an opinion on is the investigation, because that is a technical subject and it has clear lessons in it. So let us go back over how this person was actually found, step by step, and notice carefully what is missing from the list when you write it out. The anonymity network was not broken. The encryption on the laptop was never broken. The currency was not de-anonymized by anybody doing clever mathematics to it. None of that happened. What actually happened was this, in order. A username was reused across 2 posts. An email address carried a real name. A package of forged documents arrived at a real residential address in the ordinary post. A server was located by a method the sworn account describes as a configuration error, and an arrest was timed to catch a machine while it was open. Every single one of those is either an ordinary human mistake or an ordinary piece of police work of the kind that has existed for a century. Not one of them is a defeat of the technology. This is the pattern across almost every case this program has covered, and it will keep being the pattern. Systems are not usually broken at all. The people running them are traced through the ordinary, boring, permanent traces that every human being leaves behind them without ever deciding to. And notice which of those traces did the most damage of all. The one left first. Before there was a market, before there was a pseudonym worth defending, before there was anything at all worth protecting. Operational security applied from a certain date forward is not operational security. It is a fresh coat of paint over a history that is already public and already indexed. The second lesson is the one about the room, and it generalizes far past law enforcement. A correct answer arrived early and was not acted on because it looked too simple for a problem everybody had agreed was hard. If you run any kind of investigation, security, engineering, audit, incident response, anything with a genuinely hard problem sitting in the middle of it, that is your failure mode too, and it feels exactly like rigor while it is happening to you. The third lesson is about where security actually ends, in practice, rather than on a diagram. In this case, it ended at one man's attention span, in a public library, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. You can hold a system that is mathematically sound and still lose everything in the 1.5 seconds you spend looking at something else. And the fourth is the uncomfortable one, which is the 2 agents. A system built so that value can move without leaving a record does not only remove oversight from the people you happen to disapprove of, it removes it from everybody, including the 2 people holding the warrant. That is not an argument for or against any technology. It is an observation about what oversight requires, and it applies wherever the record is the only thing keeping anyone honest. So what do you actually do with all of that? 4 things, and the first 2 apply to you personally, whether or not you're in this field. 1. Go and look at your own oldest reused handle, not the one you use now. The one you picked years ago before you cared and used on 3 different sites. That handle is a join key. Anybody can use it to link accounts you have completely forgotten about to accounts you use every day, and no encryption you adopt afterwards touches it in any way. You are not going to delete the past, and I am not going to pretend you can, but you can know what is joinable, and that is the entire difference between a risk you manage and a surprise you do not. 2. Understand what full disk encryption does and does not do, because a great many people have exactly the wrong mental model of it. It protects a machine that is switched off. It protects a machine that is locked. It protects nothing whatsoever about a machine that is open, unlocked, and sitting in front of you with the session running. If that distinction matters to your work, then the thing to configure is not the cipher. It is how quickly the screen locks when you look away. 3. If you investigate anything, run the cheap test first, explicitly, and on the record, especially when you are confident it will find nothing. The lead that broke this case was cheap, obvious, and sitting in public for 2 years. It was not missed because it was hidden or clever. It was missed because it was too simple to look like an answer to a hard question. 4. Read past the headline now. This case is a working demonstration of how an untried, dismissed allegation attaches itself to a name and travels for a decade. Charged, indicted, convicted, and dismissed are 4 completely different words, and the difference between them is the difference between a fact and a rumor with a legal costume on. That habit will serve you far outside this subject, and it costs you about 30 seconds per story. Those 4 are what this half hour was actually for. Everything else, the library and the package and the 2 agents, is the story that makes them stick in your head. And I want to close on the thing that keeps surprising me about this case the more I go through the record. This was, at the time, considered close to unsolvable. Serious specialists across multiple agencies said so. It was solved by a tax investigator reading old forum posts, a customs officer opening a package, and 3 agents staging an argument in a library. None of that is a technical achievement. All of it is patience applied to ordinary places by people who were not the ones expected to find it. That is the actual shape of this entire field, and it is the reason the hardest problem in security is almost never the algorithm. It is everything happening around the algorithm. Next Thursday on Unmasked, a case that makes this one look straightforward, because the man at the center of it was working for the government the whole time. Albert Gonzalez helped federal investigators dismantle a criminal forum while running, in parallel, one of the largest thefts of payment card data ever recorded. He was an informant and the target at the same time, and for years, nobody handling him worked it out. If this case is about traces left in public, that one is about a person hiding directly behind the people looking for him. He was convicted, and the sentence he received was, at the time, the longest ever imposed in the United States for computer crime. That is next week. Before you go, one small thing that helps this channel more than anything else you could do. Tell me in the comments which of the 4 you are actually going to act on, and specifically whether you already know what your oldest reused handle is. I read them, and I answer them, and the answers people leave on these episodes have changed how later ones get written. And if you want the rest of this series, the channel is where it lives. Following it is what puts the next one in front of you. One last framing to leave you with, because it is the thing this whole episode is really about. Anonymity is not a property of a piece of software. It is a property of everything you had ever done, taken together, including all the parts you did before you needed any. Software can only ever protect the part that comes after. The rest is already written down. I am Niels. Thanks for staying to the end.